Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Admissions 360 event. My name is Owen Farsi. I'm a longtime MCAT teacher here at Kaplan, and I'll be your host for the evening. And I am joined this evening by Paul T. White, the Assistant Dean for Admissions at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Paul, it's wonderful to have you here with us this evening.
It's wonderful to be back here, Owen. Thank you for inviting me again.
Of course, we're always happy to have a chat with you. Tonight, we're going to be chatting with a number of students out there online who have questions about what it takes to actually get into medical school and really what the admissions process looks like from your perspective as someone who sits on the other side of the desk, who decides who gets in and who doesn't effectively. So I guess I want to start the conversation by just painting a little bit of a picture here, if you wouldn't mind. You've worked in medical school admissions for quite some time. You have a fair bit of experience. You've seen lots of students come and go over the years. When you sit down with an application, what does that look like? What's the scene to start things off, and what's the first thing that you look to in a student's application?
Well, you know, Owen, we always talk about it being a holistic review, and it truly is. It starts with looking at the applicant's background. We want to know where he or she is coming from, their educational background, their family's educational background. We want to know their activities. And so essentially we're looking at the secondary or supplemental application first. There are specific questions that we will ask that will not be on the AMCAS application, so I want to see how well they answer those questions. Then we look at the actual AMCAS application. Again, there's more information about the background of the applicant. Then we look at their activities. Of course, you know they can list up to 15. We want to see which 3 were the most rewarding. And we look at their academic information, the courses they've taken, the progression of their performance, the trend, if you will. And we look at their personal statement. And then the very last thing we look at are the letters of recommendation, either the committee letter or the individual letters, depending on the type of institution they attended.
Interesting, very interesting. We're going to get into all those different pieces of the application as we talk through the show tonight. Before we do, I just want to remind everybody who's out there watching tonight, this is a live show. We are taking questions from the audience right now. So wherever you happen to be, if you have questions for Paul, please go ahead and send them to us in the chat. We'll be bouncing around a bit from subject to subject as we explore the MCAT, GPA, the AMCAS application itself, letters of recommendation, all of it we're going to dig into this evening.
Great.
Now, we've actually got some questions that we preceded from folks out there online. So I think the best place for us to dig in a little bit more, it's interesting that you say that the first thing you look at is really who the student is, their demographic information, where they're coming from, what some of their background is. But for most students, the first thing at the forefront of their mind is the MCAT and the GPA. So let's start the conversation there just to get it out of the way. A question that comes up a lot from students, how do you really feel when a student takes the MCAT multiple times?
I have no problem with a student taking it multiple times. I think sometimes you have to take it to just get over the nervousness before you can get your real score, so to speak. So I have no problem if they've taken it a second time. If they want to take it a third time, that's fine. What is important, though, that we need to see that there's been some change, hopefully an improvement in those scores. But even if the score does not improve, what they should understand is that most medical schools, including institutions like Hopkins, will use the best score from a single test date. So there's no penalty. Now, if someone takes it 8 times, and I've seen that, then you have to wonder what else is going on there.
So it does raise a bit of a red flag if you see it too many times.
If you see it too many times, but 2 times, even 3 times, it's not an issue for us at all. And I think that's pretty typical of most medical schools.
Good, very good. And I just want to clarify one thing you said. You said that at Johns Hopkins you look at the best score on any single test date. Is that correct?
That's correct. Okay. That's correct. So if they've taken it multiple times, well, even twice, and the second score actually goes down, the composite score goes down compared to the first one, we will use the first test date. Even though there may be individual scores that vary slightly and maybe higher on the second one, but something has brought it down overall, we'll use their overall score, whichever is highest. And if that was from the first administration, that's the one that we will use in calibrating the students' performances.
Excellent, good. Thank you for the clarification. On the along similar lines, then, I know a lot of students also have concerns about GPAs.
Sure.
And in fact, one student asked us a question earlier, is even 1C enough to prevent me from actually getting in and going to medical school? Or is it 2, or is it 3? What does that look like?
Well, as I said initially, it's a holistic review process. So if someone has a C or 2, that's not going to prevent them from getting a close look. We read everyone's application. If there's a pattern of C's, then at some point, you have to think, okay, there are plenty of students who don't have multiple C's, but if they've had a C or even a second C or even a D, dare I say, that's not going to eliminate them from consideration for an interview at least, because an interview is not an admission offer, it's just an interview.
So what would you need to see to counterbalance that then? If you were concerned about a D or a C or multiple C's potentially on their transcripts, what would you look for to encourage you to invite them to an interview?
Well, I would hope that their letters of recommendation, particularly if they have a committee letter, will address any blips in their record, number one. Number two, I'd like to see at what point did they have the C. We talk about an upward trend or trajectory. So if you had an indifferent freshman year experience and then you caught on and performed significantly better each succeeding year, and your courses also got more challenging, and yet you continue to do well, that bodes well for you. But again, that needs to be somewhat addressed in the letter of recommendation. And as I said, it's you may get an interview. That may be a question that will be asked by your interviewer, which is perfectly legitimate thing to ask an interviewee, because we want to know what they learned from that experience and how did they remedy any less than stellar grades.
And I expect that as the interviewer, if you were to ask that, you'd expect a very strong response, an explanation
Absolutely,
of why
absolutely.
why that
Or
happens.
a genuine response.
Yes.
A genuine response, something that they clearly have come to terms with and can demonstrate that, yes, there was a problem, but I've overcome that problem.
Absolutely.
And succeeding grades will, in most cases, testify to that.
Excellent, wonderful. We've actually got a great question coming from the live audience right now that I want to make sure that we get to.
Okay.
Give me just 1 second to pull it up here. Christiana is asking, do extracurriculars and summer internships potentially make up for a GPA that could be on the lower ends? So if they had somewhat of those lower grades, I guess I would say, a C potentially.
Well, when students ask questions like that, it's all relative, because if all their grades are low, then no, a summer internship and extracurricular activities alone will not make up for that. That's why we have to look at the rigor of their academic program, the trend in terms of those grades. I mean, you have to show improvement at some point. That's why we have to pay attention to other factors that may have impacted their academics. For instance, maybe they were working a work-study job, and instead of working 10 hours a week, they were trying to do 15 or 20 hours a week, and they were taking a heavy course load. And so at some point they had to step back, hopefully. Someone, advisor, would say to them, you're here to be a student, and so they may have had to cut back the number of work hours. And if they show improvement and they've taken on some extracurricular activities, that's great. And then summers can be a great time to try to get experiences. But we find that some of our most successful applicants are involved throughout the academic year, not just the summer.
Of course, yes, absolutely. It actually reminds me of a student I've been working with relatively recently, getting ready for the MCAT, who took on just too heavy of a course load throughout the spring, and realized about halfway through that she had to cut things back in some respect, in some way.
And we've all done that, including me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's especially pre-meds have a tendency to take on a little bit more than maybe they should at that time. Perfect. Let's continue the conversation then by turning our attention to the AMCAS application.
Okay.
You mentioned before the show actually, that AMCAS just opened last week.
That's right, May 2nd, I believe.
So students are capable, are ready to fill it out right now.
That's right.
If they're going to be applying in this summer cycle. When it comes to AMCAS, you mentioned the list of 15 before, the 15 activities. And I know a lot of students have questions about what belongs on that list. Should they put 15 things in definitely, or is it permissible to only have 10 things on that list?
Oh, it's perfectly permissible to have 10. What we're looking for is in quantity, we're looking for quality of experiences. And the experiences have to vary. They can't all be in the pursuit of medical school. I mean, you know, if you've had work experience, we want to see that. If you've had service or volunteer activities, we want to see that. If you've had research, that should be there. If you've had clinical experiences, obviously that should be indicated. And anything sort of in between. And so it's always wise to try to put all those things down separately, make a list, and then call that list, you know. You find that these have to be post-secondary experiences. Hopefully you're doing something besides studying in college, because when you're in medical school, we don't expect you to drop all your interests outside of academics. You have to have a balanced experience in college and in medical school, frankly, and that's what we look for.
Absolutely. Stemming out of that then, I think that the list of 3 is another point where students sometimes get a little confused, because you have to select from this list of 15, 3 that are your most meaningful activities. What do you look for in those activities, and what does that tell you then about a student?
Well, first of all, you don't have to list 3. You can list up to 3.
Sure.
So that's the confusion I think some students have. They feel they have to, and if they don't, this is going to be seen as a negative. Not at all. If you've been doing something that has had sustained involvement, and you've grown in that organization or activity, and it does mean a great deal to you, then let us know what that activity is. If you think it's research, fine. You can talk about that. Maybe you had a publication that came out of the research. You were listed as a second author, or in some cases even as a first author. Fantastic. Or if you've been involved in an athletic team and you've grown to the point where you have leadership, that's fine too. But what we're looking for is something that that can clearly demonstrate the contribution you've made and the growth you've made with that activity.
Absolutely. I think that idea of growth is just a very hugely important thing for that aspect of the application.
Absolutely.
Show that you are growing. Excellent. Another question from the live audience then. Ashley is wondering, when we're talking about these clinical experiences or these extracurricular experiences, what types of clinical experiences are actually preferred? For instance, scribing, I know, is something that a lot of students do. Or is it preferable to participate in jobs that might require an actual license, like being an EMT or phlebotomy?
I think the field is wide open. It really depends on where you are and in terms of your physical location, but also in terms of your access to some of these activities. Not everyone has access to the kind of activities where certification might be required, such as a CNA or phlebotomy as a phlebotomist, or working as an EMS or EMT, depending on the area. So those are great experiences, but we don't expect everyone to have those. If I was able to get some training as a scribe, that's fantastic too. What we want to see is that the person has learned enough that in an application and hopefully in an interview they can talk about their understanding of patient care from having had close-up experiences.
And I think that's really the key right there, that it is about understanding the profession.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right, Owen.
Perfect. Another question, back on the concept of AMCAS then. If you are applying this cycle, when would be the ideal deadline to finish the MCAT, and I suppose also, I'm ad-libbing here a bit, to actually send in your AMCAS application?
Well, this is going to sound odd, but send it in when it's ready. And I say that because some students want to send it in the first day that they can submit, which this year is actually in May, unlike past years where it's been in June. This year it's May 31st. That's fine if it's ready. And what I mean by ready is you don't have any gaps in terms of your experiences or even in your academics. For instance, if someone knows they're going to have a tremendous summer opportunity and they'd like to include that on their AMCAS application, then wait. It doesn't mean waiting till August necessarily, but it may mean waiting until you've had at least a few weeks under your belt with that activity so you can talk about it from an informed perspective. But if you submit it in May and you haven't found anything yet, then some schools will say, we don't accept updates. And I'm talking about my institution. We don't accept updates until after you've actually been invited to interview and interviewed, and then we tell you how you can update your application. But preferably, you're getting your application in by the deadline. It's a long process. We review applications from mid-July until mid-February. Our deadline this year is October 15th. Get your AMCAS application in by October 15th. That's all I care. We don't penalize you. Some of my most outstanding applicants are the ones who submitted later because they were waiting for additional grades or additional activities, and yet they rose to the top.
So it's really about making the strongest case for yourself.
Absolutely. That's exactly it.
Perfect. Very good. Moving on then, just to make sure we cover all the bases relatively quickly, and we'll, of course, to all the students out there watching, we're going to be circling back to many of these topics. So if you have questions about things we've already touched upon, please keep sending those questions in. We'll certainly be talking more about the MCAT, about the GPA, and AMCAS down the line. So once students send in their AMCAS, the next stage in the process is the secondary application, which you spoke about a little bit before. That's where they're answering questions that are specific to your school.
That's right.
Now you said that's actually where you start.
That's our starting point. That's exactly right, Owen. It's the starting point at Hopkins. And first of all, let me explain that we do not pre-screen the AMCAS application. So everyone who submits a verified AMCAS application will receive our secondary application, usually within a week of our receiving the verified AMCAS application. And then we have a screening committee, which is composed of about anywhere from 6 to 8 of us who are seasoned members of the admissions committee, and we review every single application. Even those who might think, why are we bothering? We will still look at them because there are some pearls, some hidden gems that we might find in an applicant. And so we will spend the time and review those, as I said, through mid-February. And it's a long process, but it's worth it. They have to show patience.
So what would you see in that secondary application that makes you say, I want to invite this person to an interview, I want to learn more about them and see if they'd be a good candidate for Johns Hopkins?
Well, as you mentioned, there are Hopkins-specific questions, and I want to see how well they answer those questions because they can give us some insights into who the person is, their values, how strongly they've committed themselves to medicine, and they have to demonstrate their knowledge of patient care through their experiences, at least articulated, let's put it that way. I mean, we don't expect them to be at the level of a physician, otherwise why would they need to go to medical school, but we expect them to have some insights that they've acquired from having had some experiences. In terms of our Hopkins-specific ones, we have questions that give us insights into their interpersonal and intrapersonal skills. And so we will ask those questions both in our secondary application and in the interview itself. And my strongest word of advice is think carefully before you write those answers, because that's it. You don't get a second chance to amend them.
I think that actually leads directly to the other question I wanted to ask there, which is, we've been talking about what would you see that would invite you, if they would want you to invite someone for an interview. What are some of the big mistakes you see on the secondary that make you say, this person probably isn't right for us?
Well, we want to see some reflection in the secondary application. And one of the questions that we ask is, tell us about a time when you were not in the majority. Now, I can tell you that because anyone who applies will see that question. It's amazing how people will answer, well, I went to a foreign country and they didn't speak English, and so I wasn't in the majority. That is kind of trite. That doesn't require a whole lot of thought on their part. So that's, to put another way, that's just very shallow and superficial. We're looking for something a little more substantive in terms of their response. Someone who has never, one of the questions we ask has to do with, again, their most rewarding experience. And we tell them you can use one of the experiences from your AMCAS application, and they may come up with something that is totally just off base and that didn't have any reflection on their part, and that can really deep six their application as well.
Interesting. So it sounds like it's really about that self-reflection that you're
Absolutely,
looking for. If that's coming through, you'll want to learn more.
That's right. And that's why I say submit the application when it's ready. In fact, they should be willing to show it to someone else and let that person question whether or not this is what they really meant. If you do it in a vacuum and then you want to amend it later on, it's too late.
I think there's a related question here from the live audience. Emily's asking, what makes for a strong personal statement? What would they make that stand out to? I know that's the primary application, the MCAS, rather than the secondary.
Yeah, it is.
But it's certainly related to exactly what you're talking about.
It is. The personal statement should tell us how you arrived at the decision to want to apply to medical school to eventually be a physician. Somewhere in there, we should learn about your understanding of patients. And how medicine can improve their lives. I recently saw a personal statement where there was absolutely no mention of wanting to deal with patients. In fact, this person wrote about how this applicant's relatives had all gone into medicine, and that's why he wanted to go into medicine. That's not a really good personal statement.
Yeah.
The other thing that you have to balance that with is that they have to talk about themselves, but they have to be very careful when we're counting, and we don't do that, we don't mean to, but after a while, if you notice, there are a lot of sentences that begin with I, that becomes really distracting. And that's why it's so important to read it and reread it and reread it again, and then have someone else look at it and then rewrite it.
So it is possible for the personal statement to be too personal.
That's exactly right. Yes. It shouldn't all be about you.
Excellent. Good advice. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming from the online audience about taking time off between undergrad and medical school. Emily is asking, I have to take a 2-year break between undergrad and applying to medical school due to military service. Will my classes and GPA still be acceptable to admissions committees, or does she need to do something else to update her resume in that time?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, in a sense, Emily, your applications is going to stand out in a positive way because of your military service. Typically when people take a year or two off, we have no problems with that, even if it's 3 years. It's what they're doing with that time. She is going to be doing something I think is pretty impactful. And will give her some incredibly rich experiences that she can talk about in the application and in an interview. Your academics don't change for us. Your prerequisites don't expire. We do tell people that if it's been 4 years or more since their last biology course, they should probably consider taking. No, we actually strongly recommend that they take an advanced biological science course, molecular biology, mammalian biology, something that shows they still understand the biological sciences. But as I said, the prereqs themselves do not expire.
Good to know.
The MCAT, however, will.
That's exactly what I was going to ask.
But it also depends on the medical school and when they plan to apply. Some schools will say the score is still valid for 2 years, for 3 years. We will say it's 4 years from enrollment or 3 years from the application. So their scores are still valid for us. There's no need to change it. Now, of course, if they've done something academic in the time that they've been off and they think they may have a stronger score, then certainly retake the MCAT. But if it hasn't, it's only been 3 years and they don't want to, we're not going to push.
And I think that relates to your earlier point about submitting the strongest application possible.
That's exactly right. The only thing I would caution, though, Owen, that there are people who are taking time off because they have holes in their clinical experiences. In other words, they don't have much to show, and that's what they should be doing then. But if someone has holes in their academics, that's a student who's had maybe a few C's too many, and not early on, but throughout their tenure as an undergraduate. I would hope that that student is doing something to stay academically connected and show some improvement.
So I think this actually relates to the next question I was going to ask from Jordan, wondering what do application committees look for in a gap year? If I'm hearing you right, it sounds like it depends on what the weaknesses are in the application.
It's right. It literally comes down to case by case. Yeah. There's no set thing that we expect to see. More than half of our students entering every year have taken at least 1 year off for a variety of reasons. Some are doing the research programs in Bethesda. Some are doing an academic program abroad, you know, one of the scholarship programs, Fulbright and so forth. We've had Rhodes, obviously. Some are in the Peace Corps, and that's fine. If someone is working for a year because they need to gather their finances, strengthen their finances, I totally respect that. You know, so that's why I say it really is case by case.
Excellent. Another related question then to this conversation, Stephanie wants to know, how do you feel about older non-traditional students? How does that impact their position in the application process?
It doesn't impact it in any way. I mean, not in a negative way. In fact, they can add another dimension to the entering class. So we, you know, legally, age is not a factor. And, but even just in general, it's not an issue. As long as they've stayed connected to either the academic world or they've continued to demonstrate why medicine is something really meaningful. Now, some of these are individuals who've graduated, done something completely unrelated to medicine, but in the back of their mind, they've decided, you know what, I really do want to be a doctor, and they've gone back to school by doing a post-baccalaureate program. That's fine. I have no problems with that. If someone has been in a totally different field and wants to apply after 10, 15 years, that's great. But what they have to demonstrate is that they're still passionate in some way about becoming a physician. And usually they have to have had some experiences that will help cement that.
Absolutely. Good. Bringing it back to the conversation about the overall process of admissions then, we talked a lot about the applications, about the essays and whatnot. Let's talk about the interviews for a moment. What does the interview process look like at Johns Hopkins?
Well, we still do the traditional interview, the one-on-one. Everyone has 2 interviews with members of our committee, so we do not use non-committee members. Some schools have just interviewers, and then the admissions committee is separate. All of our interviewers are members of the admissions committee, and they are, everyone has 2, as I said, and one is a faculty member, and the other is always a 4th-year medical student or rising 4th year who's maybe taking a research year or pursuing an MPH or is in our MD PhD program. And they're all trained to give interviews, and they have to do concise interviews, write-ups, and we want to put our best foot forward, but we also want to learn a few things from the perspective of a faculty member, but also the perspective of a medical student. I want the students to tell us, is this someone you can see in class next to you? Is this someone who's going to take advantage of all the resources we offer at Hopkins?
So what are some of the mistakes that students make in the interview process?
Well, trying to seize control of the interview.
How so?
By not letting your interviewer ask his or her questions, you know. Either that person is much too comfortable, or maybe they're nervous and don't realize that it's an interview, and they go on and on and on. It's just not a good thing. We want you to be relaxed, of course, but you're there because we want to size you up. But we also want you to size us up as an institution. And if we can't learn about why medicine is important to you and what we can offer you, so that the interviewer can tell the committee, then it may have gone astray, that's all. Sometimes interviews with our students are not what they should be, because the interviewer thinks, oh, this is someone who's only 24, 25 years old, 26 years old, and wants to treat them as if it wasn't important, when in fact, our student interviewers are an incredibly important resource for us. You know, so you know, one of the things we look for at Hopkins is this someone who's going to be a team player? And our students are really adept at ferreting that out by their questions. And they do have set questions, both interviewers do, but we ask them to ask a set of questions that will get at that. And sometimes the interviewee just goes a little off script.
Okay. So another question from the online audience then. Jenny's wondering, what is the best way to prep for a med school interview?
Well, the absolute best way is to review your application.
Good good advice.
What did you write? Because you're going to be asked questions based on what's in your secondary and your AMCAS application. And if you struggle with anything that we think you should know, that's not going to come across very well with the interviewer or with the admissions committee. It makes us wonder, was this something that you just wrote down, you were checking a box, instead of this was really meaningful to me?
Now, we were actually talking about this before the show a little bit. Johns Hopkins, all the interviewers have access to the complete application, but that's not the case for every medical school.
That's correct. It is not the case. Some institutions blind their committee members from seeing any hint of the academic record. So they just see the personal statement and maybe the activities. At Hopkins, the faculty see every component of the application, and the students have access to it, but their philosophy is to just review the personal statement and then look at the application in total afterwards. And that's fine, as long as it works for them. But I know there are institutions that leave out any indication of academic GPA information and MCAT for that matter, because they don't want their committee members to make judgments based on what's in there. And presumably anyone who's been invited to an interview is strong enough academically.
That's fair. That's a great point.
It is. It's a great point. Exactly.
Excellent.
But as I said earlier, there are times though when I may invite someone to an interview who has some slips here and there academically, and I'd like to find out what happened. You see.
And that's one of the reasons you invite them.
Exactly.
Like. Interesting. Interesting. Now, presumably they would have mentioned something in their personal statement in their application?
No, not necessarily. In fact, I wouldn't dwell on that in the personal statement.
Okay.
That has nothing to do with why they want to be a doctor.
Good point. Let's take another couple of questions from the audience out there. And again, everyone out there watching, this is a live event. We're taking your questions right now. So if you have questions for Paul, please go ahead and send them to us. We'll get to as many of them as we can this evening. We've got a question here, let's see, from Vanessa. Is the duration of the extracurricular experiences more important than the quality, she writes. So is it better to have one experience that you're doing for a longer period of time, but maybe not as deeply involved with?
Well, Vanessa, that's an interesting question. I come back to what I said earlier. It's the quality of your experience that is going to mean a lot to us. But having said that, we want there to be some sustained involvement in more than just one or two activities. I think the most competitive applicants will have that demonstrated. And if you're hopping around just to say, I've done this, committees are going to see right through that. So you have to have some sustained involvement. One of the things we look for is leadership, and you're not going to have much leadership if you've only been with something a short period of time.
Absolutely. And I think actually related to that, because I've heard other advisors and other admissions committee members mention this in relation to leadership. What's your view on working at a summer camp or being involved in Division I athletics as an extracurricular activity? Most students, I find, don't think of that as part of the pre-med experience or a pre-med extracurricular necessary that's worthy of mentioning on their application.
Well, that's an interesting way to put it, because while those may not be pre-med activities, they're activities.
Absolutely.
Okay. And in terms of a summer camp, I don't know what that means anymore. I mean, is it, were you CIT? I mean, if you were probably 16. You're not, maybe it's something you did in college. But in terms of Division I sports, or even Division II, whatever, and Division III for that matter, that requires a commitment on your part, and that's certainly something we look for, commitment. And that may limit some of the other activities you're able to do, but we understand that. Again, keep in mind what I said very earlier, holistic review.
Yes.
It's not all cut and dry. That's why we have to look at everything. What's the arc in terms of their experiences, both academically and non-academically?
Absolutely. And I can say personally, as a former college athlete, that ate up a lot of time.
Yeah, it sure does. It sure does.
Clinical experiences.
Well, and the fact, we see applicants who've attended some of the military academies. They are not going to have the extensive clinical experiences that someone might have at a non-military academy, and yet they're able to get something in there, but they also have the leadership down in spades, so in most cases. So it's pretty easy to look at someone and say, well, they don't have a whole lot, and then you say, well, but they're doing this 20 hours a week, and then they're going up to Walter Reed in the summers, and it balances out for us.
Absolutely. I want to loop back for a second to the MCAT, because we're seeing that a lot of students are very concerned about the weighting of the different sections in the MCAT, specifically the Chem Phys section. I know firsthand that many students struggle with the physics concepts and applying them because it's not the biology that they're necessarily used
That's
to.
right.
So could you speak a little bit about how the different sections are viewed?
Well, Owen, we're still getting used to it ourselves, so, take this with the understanding that this is only the third year that we will have used the new MCAT going into the new cycle. We expect there to be some balance in all of your scores. That includes the chem physical, the biological foundations, the CAR score, and the psychology and social sciences sections. But that's when, if someone hasn't done well in the chemical science portion of the new MCAT, then they may want to consider retaking it because maybe they didn't have the requisite knowledge for it, and now they know what to expect.
Now, when you say if someone doesn't do well,
I
know
students
are wondering about numbers.
No, I don't get into numbers.
Okay.
I don't get into numbers because not everyone's applying to Johns Hopkins.
Certainly.
Or schools like Johns Hopkins.
That's fair. That's absolutely fair. And I know that the Johns Hopkins applicant pool certainly tends to boast larger numbers, higher numbers.
That's right. They do.
The rest of the country.
That's right. And yet we have no cutoffs.
Certainly.
Either MCAT or GPA cutoffs. There are none. Otherwise, we would be dropping the ball in terms of what we say as to a holistic evaluation of their application.
While we're on the subject, I want to talk just for a moment about the psych-soc section, the psychological and social and biological foundations of behavior section, because I know that some students, when they first come into my MCAT classroom, have questions about why this is even part of the MCAT, why it's a prerequisite for medical school. What would you say to a student who asks that?
Well, medical care has changed, and so medical education has changed to reflect that. And our curriculum, which is now in its probably 9th year, maybe 10th year, incorporates the social sciences, public health, ethics, understanding of sociology, social sciences in general. So they have to have some knowledge. We have intersession courses, we have interprofessional education that builds upon what they should have already studied in terms of psychology and the social sciences. So I think it's important that they have at least introductory level knowledge of the social sciences, including psychology.
Excellent. Very good.
And that's all they're asking for on the new MCAT.
Excellent. Let's see. I want to pull a couple more questions from the live audience. And again, to all the students out there, keep those questions coming. We've got a little over 20 minutes left in tonight's event. We want to get to as many of these questions as possible. We've got a question from Gianna asking, what emphasis, if any, is placed on graduate coursework, say a master's training program or master's granting program, and GPA in comparison to the undergraduate GPA? So how would you look at that first?
Well,
as a master's.
Yeah. Gianna, again, I'm going back to what I said earlier. There's a holistic review. If you're pursuing a graduate degree to show that you have a graduate degree, that's not necessarily going to win any favors or fans in our office. We're basing our decision on your academic record, primarily your undergraduate record. I've seen students who've had indifferent undergraduate GPAs in different coursework as an undergraduate, get into a graduate program and they seem to do unbelievably well, and then they have an indifferent or mediocre MCAT score. That MCAT score is more validation of their undergraduate work than their graduate work.
Interesting.
So that's what I mean by the holistic review of their application. The way it's reported on AMCAS is we see the GPA across these sections and down in terms of their BCPM, the biology, chemistry, physics, and math, all others, and then cumulative by each year, and that gets reported as a cumulative undergraduate GPA if they've taken any post-baccalaureate courses but not graduate courses. That is shown as a post-bac GPA and then gets calculated into their undergraduate GPA, which is where they can show improvement. If you've taken a graduate program of studies, we will see that GPA, but it won't be calculated into your undergraduate GPA because it's considered graduate. And so some people lose the benefit of their efforts to try to show improvement when in fact, a lot of these programs, I had a woman who applied to us this year, wrote to us saying that she was surprised she was rejected. She had an opportunity to do a certificate at a post-bac program, but opted for a master's program to show that she was capable of doing master's level work. She got an excellent GPA in the master's. However, her undergraduate GPA and her MCAT score were both fairly low.
Interesting.
And so we just decided that the graduate one wasn't strong enough to override the undergraduate and MCAT score.
Which would be considered the foundational courses for medical school itself.
Exactly.
Presumably in that scenario, if she had retaken the MCAT after her master's program and performed much better on it, that would be a very different story, would it not?
It would be a different story, but it also depends on where she was applying.
Of course, of course. Excellent. Let's get to a few more of these questions then. Let's see. I saw one that I wanted to look at. Yes, Stefan is asking, I've heard that a lot of medical students take time to do an MPH after undergraduate. I did it because of what I've heard about the norm, as well as being very interested in helping my entire community stay healthy, not just individual patients. How significant is having an MPH prior to applying to medical school?
It's not an issue for us. If they have it, great, but we don't expect students to have an MPH. Frankly, the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins doesn't take recent graduates into the MPH program unless they've had at least 2 years either in working for an NGO or as the medical personnel. Now, they can do an MHS, their Master of Health Sciences, but it really isn't something that we expect to see. Many of our best applicants have not had a master's or PhD. So you're not going to stand out in our pool just because you have a master's or an MPH.
Regardless of what
Regardless,
the master's is in,
it's exactly.
An MPH or an MA or MS.
Because it's something they can get when they're in medical school.
Of course, of course. And presumably there is some training in medical school on population health and some of these aspects.
Absolutely. I mean, public health is built into our curriculum.
Absolutely.
To the extent where we have a fair number of our students, between 15 and 20%, at some point will take a year off, 11 months, to do an MPH after 2 years in our curriculum.
Extending things out a little bit more.
That's right. That's right.
Let's talk a little bit more about the personal statement, because I know that's a source of concern for a lot of students, especially this time of year, as everyone's getting their applications together. We actually threw a poll up into the event, and 52% of the students who responded said they haven't started writing their personal statement yet. When would you suggest students start on the personal statement?
Well, I think it depends on when they think they're going to submit their AMCAS application. If they're thinking of submitting it on May 31st, then they better get on it right now. And even then, I'm not sure if that's enough time. If they want, if they're thinking, well, I'll get it in by the end of June, that's perfectly fine. But they have to come up with something. And maybe it requires a conversation with their pre-medical advisor, with older students they know who have gone to medical school, but they have to start formulating some ideas about the personal statement, because what you don't want to do is to rush it and then have it come across as very shallow and insignificant, because we get no sense of your values and why you want to be a physician and why you want to help patients.
I think that speaks to what you're saying earlier about the eyes.
That's right.
Too many eyes.
That's exactly right. That's what happens when you rush.
So related to that then, another question from a student. I've heard that many students tell too many stories about other people they've encountered, and not enough about themselves. Is that a common mistake that you've seen?
It's not a common mistake, but it can be a mistake on the part of the student. You have to balance it. That's the tricky part, but that again goes back to something we just discussed. If you give it enough time and preparation, you will be able to spot those errors in your personal statement. And certainly that's why it's important and incredibly important to have someone else read it, because if after reading it, after you've had someone read it and they come away thinking, I still don't get a sense of who you are and why you want to be a physician, then you need to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah. I've always been told that you should have at least 3 different people read your personal statement before you send it in. The person who knows you best to tell you if it sounds actually like you. A person who doesn't know you very well at all, at least not on the medical side, to tell you if that comes across. And the person you know who is best at grammar and sentence structure.
That sounds like a great plan.
So hopefully that's helpful for students out there. On a related topic then, as it comes to the personal statement, I think this will be a very quick question. Can you reuse a personal statement if you're reapplying for the second time?
Well, if you didn't get in before, then I would start anew.
Now start from scratch?
Start from scratch. Start from scratch. Don't go back to what you're most comfortable with because it didn't work for you. Think. That's why you have to really process this whole. It is an entire process. Then you have to think. All right, I was not successful. What were some of the issues? When they write to us and say, can you give me feedback? The feedback, not that I provide it, but it's think about it. Where were the holes in your education? Where were the holes in your experiences? And were those the issues, or was it your personal statement? Okay.
It's interesting you say that, because I feel like, and I see this often with specifically the MCAT, the way students study for it, but also I think I see it with applications at large. Students are eager to tackle the things that they think that they're already doing well at. It's sort of the path of least resistance.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
All right, let's get a few more questions here from the audience then. An interesting question here. What impact does academic dishonesty have on someone's application? Does this result in the application being completely overlooked or disregarded?
Well, I can only speak for my institution. I don't like to see academic dishonesty. I think if you're being dishonest as an undergraduate, you obviously gave into some pressures, and that was the path of least resistance, was to be dishonest, and that doesn't bode well. I'm not saying that they won't be successful at getting into other schools, but we're certainly not interested in any hints of it.
Interesting.
There's no excuse for it.
Okay. Let's move on to letters of recommendation, and I'm seeing a number of questions about that. First off, who do you like to see letters of recommendation from?
I'd like to see them from the people we asked to see them from. So at Hopkins, we require a committee letter if you attend an institution that has something called a committee letter, which is essentially a composite of the pre-medical committee written by the pre-medical advisor on behalf of the committee. If they attend an institution that doesn't have a pre-medical committee letter, we require 2 letters from science faculty who've taught the student and 1 non-science faculty member who's taught the student, generally in the humanities, social, behavioral sciences. I don't want to hear from doctors unless he or she taught you in a course. I don't want to hear from a relative I don't want to hear from a relative, period, okay? I want to hear from someone who can be objective and who can talk about your strengths and maybe your weaknesses and your growth. If you've been out of school for a year, either working or you've been enrolled in graduate school, I want to hear from someone who supervised your work as an additional letter. Now, we don't limit the number of letters they may submit, but I can personally tell you I refuse to read more than 3 or 4 letters. It's just, after a while, they all sound the same. And maybe it's because I have spent over 30-some years doing this, but I really want the letter writers to come from people who are in those subjects, those areas that we ask them to be from.
And I think it brings up a good point, that the rules of the application are there for a reason.
That's exactly right.
Thinking that they're exceeding them, that's not doing themselves any favor.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. I'm glad you said that. And we had a couple of applicants from a school which has a committee letter, and that would have sufficed. And yet the applicants both pressured, or their families may have pressured the advisor to submit 10, 12, 13 additional letters.
Wow, that's a
That
lot
was
of
seen
letters.
as, yes, it is, and that was seen as a real negative by our committee.
So it's interesting you mentioned that, because we did have another question from someone in the audience. They report that they missed the pre-med committee deadline, and they're not providing then a committee letter.
Right, that does happen.
So how are they automatically out from Johns Hopkins?
No, not at all. In that scenario, they need to have their pre-medical advisor write a letter saying that he or she will not be able to write a committee letter, and that they have missed the deadline. I do want to know that, but they'll be submitting 3 letters as we require, 2 science and 1 non-science. Now, it is up to us then to decide is what was more important, that they at least have these individual letters, or the fact that they miss their advisors, their pre-medical advisors' stated cutoff point, because that goes to some of the behaviors we look for in medical school.
Interesting. Interesting.
Again, holistic.
Again, yes, absolutely. I think I'm sensing a theme.
There is a theme. There is a theme.
Another question that we haven't touched too much on this yet tonight. Do you treat international students who completed undergraduate education in the U.S. Differently from U.S. citizen students?
No, not at all. We're fortunate in that we're a private institution, and if they've studied in the U.S., they're treated like any other student applying from the same institution. They may actually have some interesting experiences that they bring in terms of not being in the majority and how they can answer that on their secondary application, but they're treated the same as any other domestic candidate applying for admission. Now, if they've studied exclusively abroad, and that's regardless of whether they're a U.S. citizen or non-citizen, because if they've studied abroad, everyone is required to then supplement their degree with at least 1 year of study in the U.S. So that could be someone who's from California, who went to school in England. He or she would still need to have an additional year of study in the U.S. because the academic system is that different from ours. But if there's an international student who's applying for admission and has studied, at the University of Maryland, he or she will be reviewed like any other student applying from Maryland. The only difference is, and we have nothing to do with it, is if they're admitted, they want to apply for financial aid, they are aided as a non-U.S. citizen, but we do provide funding for non-citizens.
Excellent, excellent. And I know you mentioned that that's specific to Johns Hopkins.
That is specific to Johns Hopkins.
Other
right,
schools
right.
have their own rules.
Yeah, they do. Some schools won't accept any international student, regardless of where they've gone to school. Some will say they will only accept someone who has had the prereqs in the U.S. Some will say we will only accept students who have first proffered a escrow and showing they can pay 4 years of tuition and total cost of attendance. We used to do that, but we stopped doing that about 6 years ago. 6 years ago.
Excellent.
So.
Well, the clock is running out fairly quickly on the event. It's hard to believe how fast things have gone. But I do want to get to some more of these questions.
Sure.
One that I think is related to what we're talking about here. You mentioned that international students that can help them stand out in some instances, depending on their experiences. A question from a student: how do we make ourselves stand out in the application process when everything we've done is the usual pre-med thing?
Well, I think they've answered the question themselves. It's hard to stand out, but you have to be the best you can be in terms of your own self. It's not a checklist. That's where their individuality has to come through their application. They're going to bring something to it, no matter if it looks like something 100 others did. It's what they got out of it and how they can articulate why it was important to them and how it impacted those they were working with or helping or volunteering with. And that can't be replicated by others. So we want them to talk about how much it meant to them and how it will help them in terms of their future career, depending on the question.
I think it speaks back to what we were saying about the list of 15 and the personal statement, that even if the experience may have been similar to someone else.
Oh, it's
the
undoubtedly going to be similar, but it's what they got out of it that's going to be different.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Let's see then. A great question here. Does applying and being rejected hurt your chances of being accepted the following year?
Not necessarily. It depends on, if you're talking about the same institution, You know, personally, I want them to take a year off before they reapply to me. Because if they were rejected, and then they just, you know, let's say in the 2018 cycle, which is just completed, and the 2019 just started, and they've rammed through another application, what's different in the 2019 application from the 2018 application? If there's no difference, then it's probably not advisable to apply to the same institutions. If they had an experience in 2017, 2018, that they couldn't add to that application. Remember, I said I don't accept updates unless you've been invited to interview. But let's say there's something they did after they filed the AMCAS application that is really going to add some dimension, some depth to their application, then fine. But if it's going to be the same application with a new year on it, then that's a mistake. I don't care where they're applying, it's a mistake.
It's really about making changes and like we said before.
Substantive changes.
Yep,
substantive changes right.
that give you your strongest application.
That's correct. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Again, I think we have a theme for tonight. Let's see, a few more questions then. Let's see, another question here. Are there times when, depending on your university's offered classes, where prerequisites might be overlooked? For instance, my university does the ordinary 2 semesters of chemistry in a single semester. Is that fine for the prerequisites?
Yes, that's perfectly fine. That is something that's become more and more common for us to see in the last few years. There's a 3-course chemistry sequence at some of their leading institutions in the country. We have to adapt to that. I'm the person at Hopkins who reviews everyone's prerequisites who's been offered admission. I definitely have had to learn that it doesn't always come bottled as 2 years of general chemistry or 2 semesters of general chemistry, 2 semesters of organic chemistry. We don't even require 2 semesters of orgo and a semester of biochemistry. That's 5 courses of chemistry. I'm seeing more and more places that have 3 and 4 total of chemistry, and that's fine.
So by extension of that, then, we've seen a number of questions tonight that ask, do I really need to take X class? So whether it's psych or microbiology, anatomy and physiology, how would potentially not having one of those classes that might be listed in, say, the MSAR as a recommended class, how would that hurt their chances?
Well, look at the wording in the MSAR and maybe on the school's website. If it's a recommended course, that means you have to take it. You don't have to take it to apply necessarily. I've admitted students who've not fulfilled our prerequisites. They cannot enroll, though, until they've completed the prerequisites, and we give them until August 1st of the year they plan to matriculate. So that could be a full semester or a year after they've actually applied, but they will not be able to matriculate without fulfilling the prereqs. But recommendations are just that, requirements. Suggestions, recommendations are not, recommendations aren't requirements. Requirements, prerequisites, you have to fulfill. Recommendations, it'd be nice to see, but make sure you understand the difference.
And we've got time for just one last question, it looks like. I want to make sure it's a good one. I had one lined up. Where did it go? Well, we'll go with this one right here. What are your thoughts on students with average grades who go to a post-bac program after undergrad to improve their chances of getting into medical school? And is there more that you would expect to see from a student like that?
I expect a student who does a post-bac to enhance their academics, to really knock it out of the ballpark. They can't go to a post-bac and have average grades, because then they're just seen as an average student at that point, or really in many cases below average. But if you've done one of these academic enhancement post-bacs as compared to the as compared to the career changer post-bac, someone who was a non-science major and then came to the realization that she wanted to be a physician after working a couple of years, she's going to do a career changer post-bac. But someone who was a science major and had average grades and wants to enhance his or her grades will do, in some cases, a master's or special master's. They have to do very well. Those students are successful getting into medical schools.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that's just about all the time we have for this evening. So I just want to give you one chance to offer your biggest piece of advice to students who are going to be applying in this upcoming cycle, who are maybe working on their AMCAS, maybe filling it out right now while this is on in the background.
Well, you know, Owen, you've said it a couple times, there seems to be a theme here. One of the themes is they really need to take the time. This is an important process for them, but they need to take the time, not rush their application, submit it when it's ready, maybe submit it when we can see the growth that they've demonstrated either academically or in terms of their clinical or research experiences. But you know, there's no reason to rush it through. That's not going to make it better just because you rush it.
Excellent. Well, Paul, I want to thank you again for taking the time to come in and chat with us this evening. I think you've offered a lot of great advice. We covered a lot of different topics, a lot of material this evening.
Well, I've enjoyed it.
But I'm sure that the students out there enjoyed it as well, and hopefully they've got some great takeaways to help guide them through the next couple of months if they're applying. So thank you, Paul. To everyone out there, I want to thank all of you as well for tuning in this evening. If there are additional questions, please keep them coming. We have some folks online who are answering questions. And of course, we have more events lined up this week for our Road to Your White Coat series. So please continue to tune in, and we look forward to seeing you in future events. Thank you all, and good night.